同事，慢慢啊，慢慢。
Colleagues, take your time. We have already given you 15 minutes allowance. Alright, this is the appointed time. We have already formed a quorum. I now call the meeting to order. Minutes of the meeting held on the 25th of March 2013 have been circulated to members via electrical paper CB-1-1331. We have not received any proposals for amendments. Shall we confirm the minutes? Alright, no objections. Then minutes confirmed. Information paper issued since the last meeting. We have received several papers. One is a referral memorandum from the Public Complaints Office on the views given by a member of the public regarding the policy on waste management, paper number CB-1-1278-01, and also a letter dated 6th of June 2013 from Mr. Kwok Wai Keung and Teng Ka Pil, proposing to discuss the control over the noise of street arts performances. And also there is another letter from from Dr. Kenneth Chen about the conservation of a Chinese white dolphin. So, any comments if we put these two items on the list of outstanding items for discussion? In fact, the HA panel has also discussed the issue of street arts performances, but then they are not focusing on the noise issue. But then when we discuss this item, we can also invite members of the HA panel to join us, because with regard to noise pollution control at the subcommittee on air, noise and light pollution, we'll be discussing that as well. But then when we discuss that, we should be discussing the nuisance that might be caused to the neighborhood. So that would be placed on the list of outstanding items for discussion. And when we discuss that, we will invite the members from the HA panel to join us. With regard to the issues relating to the conservation of Chinese white dolphins, we will have to approach the ED panel as well, because when the third runway of the airport is going to be built, definitely the Chinese white dolphins would be affected, and also the navigational channels will also be affected. So we will have to discuss this, and it will be placed on the list of outstanding items for discussion. And our next regular meeting in July is to be held on the 22nd of July at 2:30, and it's after the last council meeting. I hope that we will still be able to have it as scheduled. And one will be on the ocean liners switching at berths for fuel, and also upgrading the diesel standard for local vessels. So two items for the July meeting. Any comments on that? If not, then we'll discuss these two items at our July meeting. So if everything goes well, then that will be our last meeting within this session. With regard to mandatory fuel switch at berths for ocean-going vessels in Hong Kong waters, we'll be inviting the stakeholders to join us. So we'll be approaching the local vessel advisory committee and also the ship owners and relevant parties, and inform them that we're going to hold this public hearing, and then they'll be invited to join us. Next item on the agenda, external lighting in Hong Kong. We have two papers. Paper number CB-1-1332-03 and 04. One is provided by the administration, and the other is provided by the Secretariat. It's about external lighting in Hong Kong. We have actually got another group, that is a task group chaired by Professor Lam Kin Chi, which is responsible for liaising with the business sector. Sorry, we don't have 4 seats in the front row, and officials would like to be seated together. That's why they are sitting at the back row. And we have the Bureau Director. We also have Professor Lam Kin-chi, Chairman of the Task Force on External Lighting, and also Ms. Vivian Lau, Deputy Secretary for the Environment, and Mrs. Dorothy Ma, Principal Assistant Secretary for the Environment. Over to you, Professor Lam, and also Mr. Wong. Can you walk us through the paper? Madam Chair, I'd like to give more time to Professor Lam, who's the Chairman of the Task Force, who will spend a few minutes on the paper. Over to you, Professor Lam. Well, Chairman, I'll be brief in my presentation on the work of the task force during the past 2 years, and also the line of thoughts of the task force. Well, the task force was set up in August 2011, and we have been given the task to advise the government on the appropriate strategy and measures for tackling nuisance and energy wastage problems caused by external lighting. And at the outset, we have taken reference from international parameters and also experience and practices. For example, we have looked at the zoning issue, and also energy wastage, and also the nuisance that might be caused by external lighting, and also requiring a mandatory switching off at specified time. With regard to internationally practiced parameters, there are some technical difficulties in implementing that in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is a densely populated place, and also given the mixed use of lighting, it will be difficult to come up with hard and fast rules. And therefore, after deliberation, the task force is of the view that probably an easier way out is to impose a switch-off requirement, because that would be relatively simple and specific. And when it comes to switching off lights, it's about the timing of switching off lights, and also when they can switch them back on. And in the overall consideration, we have also considered that if the switch-off requirement is the starting point, then what should the approach be? Should it be done on a voluntary basis, or should there be some form of a charter, or should it be done by way of legislation? And in the course of deliberation, we also understand that with regard to the points that I just made, they are not mutually exclusive. In other words, we can also impose this regulatory requirement, but then given the time that will be taken for the legislation or legislative process, we can also do it by way of a voluntary approach first. And if it's to be done by way of a charter, then there should also be a timetable for us to review the situation, and if it doesn't work out, then we can consider introducing legislation to mandate such switching off. And the task force will also be doing this in the next 2 months. We'll be consulting extensively with the stakeholders to get their feedback. In particular, if we were to impose this switch-off requirement, should it start from 11 p.m. or 12 midnight, and the application, what sort of lighting should be regulated, and how the exemptions should be granted, and so on. So these would be considered. So in simple terms, if there is a community-wide consensus, then the task force will not rule out the possibility of introducing legislation. But then the most pressing issue is to consult the stakeholders. Thank you, Madam Chair. Bureau Director, anything to add? I think I'll allow for more time for discussion with members. All right, please indicate if you'd like to speak. All right, I'll read out the names first. As we all know, all right, if there aren't that many hands, then I'll be very relaxed, and then I'll try to compress the time when more people would like to speak. All right, 6 members would like to speak, including myself, Wong Kwok Heng, Gary Chan, Chan Kin Po, Kwok Wai Kang, and Deputy Chairman. All right, I saw you raise your hand. All right, Christopher Chung, and also myself, and Dennis Kwok. So altogether 7 members, and we will discuss this item until 3:45. And if we have 7 members, then 5 minutes each first, And then after the 7 members, if we have another round, then I'll try to cut short the time. Mr. Wong Kwok Hing, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not a member of the panel, but thank you very much for allowing me to ask questions. All right. Well, in August 2011, this task force was set up, and Professor Lam, you just gave us a very succinct overview of what's been done. But then with regard to light pollution, I think the administration must show its determination in tackling this problem in order to protect the right of the public to have a good rest. Well, as a directly elected member from the Hong Kong constituency, I often receive complaints from Wan Chai, Causeway Bay and North Point residents saying that they have been subject to the nuisance caused by the intense lighting, and their sleep has been seriously affected. They've been criticizing the administration for the lack of legislation to control the situation, and now the task force proposes 2 initiatives. One is by way of legislation and also by way of a charter, so that it will be done voluntarily. But then my view is, if it's to be done on a voluntary basis, it's hard to yield any effect, because why do they have to turn on the lights which are so intensive? That's because they like to facilitate their business. That's because they like to promote their business. And therefore there is an inherent conflict, because it's very much profit driven. And if it's to be done on a voluntary basis, then given Hong Kong's free society, it means that if the public would like to enjoy a good night's sleep without being subjected to the nuisance of such intensive lighting, then they will not be able to have it at all. That's why that will have to be done by way of legislation. It's like noise nuisance, because there is noise pollution control. In fact, for lighting pollution or light pollution is very much linked to many business operations, and it's difficult to segregate the two. And that's why, as the professor just said, if we were to control the situation, if we were to impose this switch-off requirement, I'm all for it. That's why I'm of the view that we should consider doing this like what we do for noise control, so that between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. the next morning, there is a need for us to ensure that the public will be able to enjoy a good night's sleep. The right to rest should be protected, or else the public will not be able to enjoy a full night's sleep, and that's not going to work.
If you walk from Wan Chai to Causeway Bay, some of the light is really very bright, and it's directly faced to residential buildings, and these lights would be turned on overnight. And even more serious are the mega screens, and these are actually movable screens. If we do not effectively regulate these, then how is the public going to get enough rest? It should not only be done on a voluntary basis. The minimum you can do is, before it becomes legislature, you could do it on a voluntary basis. I know that it takes time to legislate. It might take 1.5 years if it's processed very quickly. If not, it might take an even longer time. So during this time, or during this period, the government can promote voluntary effort to try to fulfill the businesses' corporate responsibility. I hope to hear the response from the Secretary for the Environment. Thank you. The new government is very concerned with light pollution. As you said, in some certain districts, especially in some areas where many of the grassroots population live, there is serious light pollution. We are going to seriously look into this matter, and I, together with my colleagues, would conduct on-site inspection. We're going to go to Yau Chim Wong district to try to understand the situation and try to meet the needs of the public. Mr. Lam, please. visited many of the places together with the members of the task force, and we understand the concerns of Mr. Wong. Mr. Chen, please. Chair Lady, well, after looking at the geographical location of Hong Kong, I see that the task force has come up with quite a pragmatic approach, which is to take reference from what the other countries have been doing to set a switch-off requirement. But I want to know who you were targeting to introduce the switch-off requirement, and how are you going to take this step by step? When are you going to start the first stage and then the second stage? Secondly, well, before legislature, the government has already promoted a set of guidelines, but you can see that the figures of complaints remain at about 230 per year. There is not much fluctuation, especially in Yau Chin Wang, Wan Chai, Sha Tin. You can see that there has not been any reduction in the number of complaints in those areas. And from 2011, you can see that in some areas the complaints have risen from 11 to 18 in Yuen Long. So I want to ask the government if there is a necessity to set up legislature. Well, I think Yuen Long is done quite well. In 2011, there were 13 complaints, but 2012 it dropped to 2. This is quite successful. So how did you reduce pollution? What did you do? Is it because that the businesses in Yuen Long they listen to you and they try to turn off their lights? And how about in Yau Chin Wang, Wan Chai, and Sha Tin? Are those businesses not listening to your recommendations? Thank you. I would respond briefly, and then I would invite Ms. Vivian Lau to supplement. In the second stage public consultation, we hope to conduct it in the upcoming months. We are going to look at the specific time for switching off, whether it should be 11 p.m. or midnight. Members understand that in special occasions such as Christmas and New Year, we can waive the requirement. And we also need to look into the details of external lighting, and then to set up the regulations for switching off, for the switching off requirement. Ms. Lau, please. Well, the number of complaints of external lighting in the past few years, you can see that the number has remained at about a few hundred. But after the launching of the guidelines last year, you would see that when we receive complaints, then we would invite the owner of the lighting to review the guidelines. The owner of the lighting is usually willing to do some sort of adjustment. They're willing to adjust the brightness, to lower the brightness by 1 to 2 grades, and they would try to switch off the lights at an earlier time. So actually the guidelines are effective. Usually the owners of the lighting are willing to cooperate with us. I see that Yuen Long is especially successful, a reduction of number from 13 to 2. But then why has the Yuen Long figure risen? Because, I mean, if they try to cooperate with you, then the figure should be lower than before. But if I just look at the figures here, you can see that the number has risen on the reverse. Well, for individual districts, well, I don't have the details on hand right now. I think we can make an extra effort in the introduction of the guidelines? Well, usually we would first review the complaint and then invite the owners of the lighting to review the guidelines. Last year, we did some promotion. I'm sure that we could make a better effort in the future. Well, Mr. Chen, well, yes, of course, it's good to have guidelines. At least you know what the standards are, and it'll be easier for you to ask the owner of the lighting to review the guidelines. But you can see that the actual figures have not really changed a lot. So can you elaborate more on how you're going to follow up on complaints? What do you really do? How do you resolve the situation? I'd like to ask about paragraph 15. You suggested there should be a switch off requirement, but in Hong Kong you would see that most of the light nuisance or pollution actually come from those areas where it's very busy at night. Well, for those people, midnight might be early for them because it's all relative. Well, if you ask the industries, I'm sure that they would object. So how do you really consult the stakeholders? Because in those districts, well, they pay a lot of rent, or they spend a lot of money to buy the premises. And if you ask them to switch off the lights, then it might have a huge impact on them. Well, of course, it's a good thing that you're not asking them to do it immediately. They still have some time to think about it. I think that other than legislation, there's not much you can really do to make them turn off the lights, because those businesses have invested hugely into those advertising signs. So I would like to hear how you're going to conduct the consultation. Thank you. Professor Lan, let me first address the second half of the question, and then Ms. Lau will address the first half. In the coming 2 months, we are going to conduct a public consultation. We're going to consult the public stakeholders and the districts. Well, we believe that we would hear different views, and we want to try to work hard to come up with a recommendation suitable for all. Professor, well, I hope you would seek the views of the industries, but perhaps the catering business or those who are really affected by this. Because if you listen to the views of the public, of course they would be in favor of it. But how about those in the industries? They might object because it would affect their business. Mr. Chen, yes, we're going to do that. In the task force, we do have members from the different industries, and we understand that the stakeholders are the most affected. Thank you, Mr. Kwok. Oh, he hasn't addressed the first half of the question regarding complaints. Ms. Lau. The complaint figures. We've actually conducted some analysis and found that although there are a few 200 odd complaints, the content of the complaints are not exactly the same, especially in 2012. If it's related to business related, such as signs or major screens, the complaints are actually less. And in 2012, we have complaints regarding golf courses, race courses, etc. We are going to try to look into these complaints. Right now, we do not see any kind of specific recommendations. For that, if you only look at business-related signs or those regarding media in the past year, I think you can see that the numbers have actually reduced in comparison with the previous year. Mr. Kwok, Thank you. I think you all understand that the majority of the public hope that there would be legislature on noise pollution because it affects the quality of the sleep of the public. Although the EP said that a lot has been done to follow up on the complaints. Actually, you can see that the complaint number has not really been reduced. So after following up, do you know of any improvements made in those complaints, and for those newly added signs and other new facilities that cause complaints? I would also know about that number. Professor Lam said that there is going to be an upcoming consultation, and they're going to discuss about whether the switch-off time should be set at 11 or midnight. If we do not want to have too much conflict or argument, we believe that the first legislature should not be too stringent. We could be more lenient and to pick midnight, because in future the legislation could be tightened. So I hope that you could first take a more lenient stand in the beginning before you tighten it in the future. And I'm a bit worried about those that would be waived. Well, if you waive some of the external lighting, so would there not be too much difference, for example, such as for security and those in regard to safety? I remember reading from the news that the Hong Kong government has also been complained about, and this was an article from early of June on our lighting near Shenzhen that is actually causing light nuisance to those living across the border. Well, actually the commercial and residential buildings are now intermingled. Well, if you're talking about a business building making noise nuisance for the residential building living across that, for the people who live in the residential building, would they also be waived? Well, regarding the waiver, I think that the public consultation would be a very good opportunity for us to collect more views.
As to any concrete or specific improvements, and also what are the newly added categories of complaints, I'll defer to Ms. Lau, who can supplement on that. Professor Lam, anything to add? I have nothing to add. I'm grateful to Mr. Kwok for his views. Yes, Ms. Lau, well, on the lighting restriction zone, I understand that after receiving the complaint, the police force has already given a full response, because it involves the restricted zone, and also because of the closed areas security reasons, they will also have to keep a close eye on that. And as the police has already given a full response, I'm not going to supplement on that. With regard to the effectiveness of the guidelines, as I said, the number is more or less the same, but then in terms of the categories of complaints, for complaints against signboards and also for video walls, well, before the issue of guidelines, after the issue of guidelines, actually the number has come down. For example, for building facade in 2011, we had 55, but then in 2012, we only had 5 cases. So a drop from 50 plus to only 5 cases. So it's a very significant drop. With regard to the newly added categories, and of course, we are also very concerned about that, and we will deal with them accordingly. For example, there have been cases on facilities that have practical uses, for example, car parks, swimming pools, leisure facilities, and also public cargo working areas and so on. And our colleagues will be following up on those complaints accordingly. Also, on the exemption, will there be too many exemptions, and as a result, that might render the law ineffective? Deputy Chairman, thank you. I suggest that we should go for a charter before we introduce legislation, because we've already suggested that there might be some problems. Who should be granted the waivers, and where would the problems be, and also would that be too strict or too lenient? And if we introduce the legislation, if we were to introduce the charter first, then we can also review the situation. In particular, the major businesses should be asked to sign up the charter, and then that would help. And after a while, we will decide on the flexibility and how the exemptions should be granted. And if we were to go for legislation right away, indeed, legislation will take time. And therefore, in any case, we will have to introduce the charter first. And once the legislation is in place, if you want to amend the legislation, that will again take time. And instead of just asking them to do that on a voluntary basis, they will at least have to be signatories to the charter. And if they are not honoring their words, then we can also give them a call and a soft reminder, and they will also have a chance to give us their feedback. And my question for the professor is, all right, on signboard lights, it's not just about the intensity of the lights, it's about the flashing lights. And also for video walls and so on, well, the impact would be even more serious. Very often, well, I also used to live in a tenement block, and there was a signboard outside the wall, and then as soon as I closed the curtain, it's okay. But then the flashing lights are the problem now. So it's a technical point. Well, have you conducted any assessment on the intensity and also on the flashing lights? Would there be any difference? And also, if it's over a certain intensity and if it's a flashing light, then to what extent will that impact on people? So will there be a quantum jump if it's a flashing light with very high intensity, for example? So what you mean is, so should we tighten up the standards so that in the process we'll be able to get hold of more details, and then by the time when we introduce legislation, we'll be able to balance the needs of different sectors? Well, I've taken on board your views. We'll consider that. All right, on the intensity and also the impact of flashing lights, all right, the task force is not a study group. In fact, we have made reference to the consultants engaged by the administration and the report that the consultancy group has prepared, but then not many details are included. But then I do understand the nuisance that might be caused by flashing lights, and I'll also convey this concern to the task force when we discuss this. Madam Chair, I'm a bit disappointed. I would have expected the professor to have taken reference from some overseas or international organizations with regard to the impact of flashing lights on people's health. I would have expected you to have been able to explain a bit more to us. Well, all right, if the intensity is above a certain level, then all right, if you're above a particular intensity, then you will have to switch it off before 12 midnight or before 11 midnight or before 11 p.m. All right, but then for video walls, it's not possible for them to stay on a particular static picture, or else the video will shut down altogether. So the impact on the residents in a neighborhood will be more significant. So please do provide us with the information. Professor? Yes, I'll convey this concern to the task force, and I'll try to see if the Bureau and the department can get hold of more information for us. All right, thank you. Mr. Dennis Kwok. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, other colleagues have already raised a number of questions. I'm not going to repeat them here. But what I'd like to say is, Well, looking at it from the environmental impact assessment ordinance, if they are going to start works on certain infrastructural projects, then under the EIAO, how would light pollution be dealt with? So has the task force looked into this? Have you had any discussion on that, Professor Lam? Thank you, Mr. Kwok, for your question. At the task force, we have not really looked at the EIAO in detail. The reason why I raised this because if you refer to the EIAO, if you look at the technical memorandum in the Annex 18, para 7.1, in the last column, it talks about light pollution. There's it's about visual impact assessment. So there might be a need for them to consider any possible light pollution. And if that's something that you will have to deal with, all right, you've already got the provision in place. And also in the technical memorandum, well, the Bureau Director has the power to amend it. So would you consider enriching the content on light pollution in the technical memorandum so that the standards can be tightened? So that for whatever initial conclusion that you've come to, you can also include that in the technical memorandum so that you'll be able to deal with light pollution from the environmental protection perspective. Have you considered that, Professor? All right, I'll briefly respond to Mr. Kwok and then I'll defer to the Bureau. All right, I'll jump out. I'll be putting on another hat because at the EAC, I've been following up on environmental impact assessment for a long while. Well, in conducting any environmental impact assessment, one of the initial steps is to define the scope of the works to be covered by the EIAO, and very often we'll be looking at some major projects before we can catch that under the EIA network. But then very often when we see some of the lights and signboards and so on, for the installations themselves, they might not be covered. Yes, I do understand that. All right, I wonder if the Bureau Director or the department would like to respond to that. All right, for external lighting, all right, we've been talking about light pollution. In fact, this is a relatively new science. So it's not like noise nuisance that we can decide on the noise level above a certain decibel, and then that would constitute a nuisance. Well, during the past years and months, we've been looking at overseas experience, and we've also consulted those scholars that have been studying light science. All right, according to them, by light pollution, there is no objective standard to say that above a certain level, then that would constitute a nuisance or pollution. And if there isn't such a standard, then how can we include that in any specific legislation? That's why they've also raised a lot of doubt about this. But then Mr. Kwok refers to the EIAO. Often the time that would only be applicable to some major infrastructure projects, for example, some major projects. But then for the task force that has been looking into this, well, basically, it has been focusing on signboards for commercial uses or for marketing or promotional uses. And for those for operational uses, we have actually not touched on that. And as we have said in the paper, we have taken reference from overseas experience. In some overseas jurisdictions, they've also put in place some legislation on noise nuisance or light nuisance. And for certain uses that have operational necessities, for example, for certain, for example, the lighting at container terminals or at ports or at the airports or even at railway stations. Well, if they have to use certain lighting during nighttime, there might be specific uses, and therefore, in dealing with the issue of external lighting, for those lighting for specific purposes, we would not deal with them. Mr. Kwok, thank you, Madam Chair. All right, we still have Tony Chair and myself who haven't asked in the first round, so we both have 5 minutes. So are there any other members who would like to ask in the first round? If not, then in the second round, we have 2 more members, and I suspect that I'll be asking in the second round is Wong Kwok Heng and Kwok Wai Keung. All right, 2 minutes each. Mr. Tony Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. With regard to light pollution, I think the public or many people are of the view that the administration really has to do something about it. And basically, there is excessive lighting in the community these days. But then, as many have said, as the task force has said, it's difficult to come up with certain standards and parameters to go by, and sometimes it's pretty objective. It's pretty subjective. For example, for excessive lighting or light trespass, and also for glare on residents, and also for sky glow and so on, it's difficult to come up with some objective parameters. And also for the impact of light on people. Well, some people might think that it's quite a nuisance. It's not just about the intensity of the lights. Well, we have often said about the curtain walls, the glass curtain walls. Well, but then there is a reflection. It's not about the intensity of the lights themselves. And therefore, in the architectural design, something has to be done, including some planning work. Alright, if it's right next to a residential block, and if you have to install a glass curtain wall, have you considered the reflection of sunlight, for example? So basically, these are very complex issues, and it's not just about one single area. And also, you also talk about sky glow. Alright, if the air is polluted, then there might be a lot of suspended particulates, and therefore you might feel that it's very intense in terms of the light. But then if it's a cloudless sky, then at night the impact would not be very significant, and therefore it cannot be done overnight. And also for the regulation or control of external lighting, I can see that there are some difficulties. And yes, I understand that you're going to do it gradually.
But before we do that, I'm not sure if the government would consider taking it in stages. For some of the external lighting, such as advertising signs, in housing, for example, sometimes only look at the safety, but can you also consider the lighting? When you're seeking for approval, could you also consider the switch-off time, the intensity of the lighting, and whether it's flashing lights or lights of different colors? I think that it would expedite the process. Well, yes, of course, we are all pursuing perfection. But if we want to wait around, then not much can be done. I think that we should perhaps take this step by step, and there might be, and it might be more effective. So you could perhaps consider this a proposal. I see in the annex that in Chun Wan, you see that in 2011 there were 13 complaints, but in 10 to 12 there were only 2. So what especially did you do in Chun Wan to witness such success? There is such a huge drop in the number of complaints. Well, I think that if there is something special that you did, you must share it with the other districts. Thank you. Well, I think Mr. Jie gave a very good recommendation. We are also going to take this into consideration. I think that in the southern district, the number also increased. Well, the enforcement, the officer in charge of enforcement is not present. I'll try to address why the figures in Chun Wan reduced hugely. I'm going to try to follow up. Well, I think you should have these figures on hand, because this Annex B is actually from June of this year. So I think you should have these figures with you. Well, I think this is not the first time we're mentioning about the figures. Well, I don't know the reason behind that. But Chun Wan has done really well in reducing the number of complaints. Well, I do have the figures in Annex B because they are part of the papers. But Mr. Jie asked about the reason behind this huge reduction, and I don't have these reasons on hand. Well, you said you didn't have the figures and not the reasons. Well, I don't really accept your answer, because since you are the one who submitted the figures, then of course you would assume that we are going to ask about it. And you know, there's really such a great cut in the number of complaints. We could really try to see what Chin Wan did, and the other districts could learn from them. My turn to ask questions. I'd like to ask Professor Lan. You said that you would start the consultation with stakeholders in the next 2 months. So what stakeholders are you talking about? I think that the views of the public are very clear. They have a complaint for a long time that the lighting has affected their sleep. We have seek the advice of an expert, and he had said that if your sleep is disturbed or affected, then it would lower your immune system. Well, for the wattage of the lighting, although other overseas cities use it to measure energy efficiency, I think we should also take this into reference. Well, although we might not be able to really set a standard for the lighting power density or wattage per square meters, we really should try to set a standard. For advertising lighting power density, it might be difficult to really address. But for some of the security lighting, I think that even it's complicated, you must try to lower the LPD. Because as the businesses might say that, oh, I'm still in operation, so still need this power density. Therefore, I think that we must not try to evade from the standard of lighting power density. The most complaints we receive are the small sign or the small signboards of about 400 square meters, and for those advertising signboards on whitening, the entire signboard is white and the power density is really strong. I hope that your bureau would work together with the development bureau and try to work together. Do we really need such a huge signboard? That you would need a signboard the size of a small unit to promote to ladies that whitening is so important. The next question I would like to ask is the consultation in the next 2 months. How long would this take? If you are you going to consult on the lighting power density or whether there should be legislature? I think that we are all very clear about legislature. It's just like a genetic modifying labeling. If you ask the industry, of course they would object to it. So even if you are going to just only consult the industry on lighting, of course they are not going to agree to it. So how many more consultations do you need to do before you can really bring this up to us again? Regarding the consultation period and who the target will be, right now in our CR we have experts on property, tourism, people from the districts, and we hope that we'll be able to tell the public via the media so that we'll be able to collect everyone's views. Regarding lighting power density, although we have talked about this for a long time, I'd like to thank Ms. Ho for your recommendation. I'll bring this back to the members of my task force. The consultation would be done in the next 2 months, and after consultation we are going to carry out internal discussion and then submit the results to you. Well, how long would the consultation take? I think it would be completed within the next 2 months. Okay, so it will be completed by then. Yes. So my understanding is that you were able to provide a report to the Secretary for the Environment. So when are you going to set up legislature? I think that we're talking about August. The task force would first submit a report, and after receiving the report, we are going to collate everything together and then submit it to LegCo. Thank you. Mr. Fang wants to ask a question. Well, I'm sorry, our time is almost up because we still have these 2-minute second round questions. So please limit your time to 3 minutes. Thank you. Well, the advertising signs actually are very important to wholesale advertisement. If you make the entire industry switch off the lights, it's going to affect us greatly. Well, you know that Hong Kong is a metropolis, and people always say that we are the Pearl of the Orient. If we are taking out all the lights, then it would hugely affect our businesses. I also agree, however, on the other hand, that the signboards are becoming bigger and bigger and the intensity higher. Especially there are ones that are directly across from the residential buildings. So I agree that for those with high intensity, perhaps you could ask them to turn down the brightness of the lighting. The commercial district and the residential districts are actually intermingled in Hong Kong, so it is very hard to draw a line for the zones. So I think that the government should try to strike a balance. For those with really high intensity, you should ask them to turn down the brightness, and you should set a time to regulate them. In the paper, you talked about a switch-off requirement around from midnight to 7 a.m. in the morning. Should you really switch off all the lights during that time? I think that it's not a problem. If you ask the catering business or wholesale business to switch off the lights, that's not a problem. But many of this lighting for the advertising signs actually work as security lighting as well. If you switch off everything, then do you need to brighten up the street lights or the street lamps? And are you talking about a switch off at exactly midnight? So how are you going to ensure security in each district if it becomes entirely dark at midnight? Sometimes you see that pedestrians, they are happy that there is lighting because, they find it easier to walk with lighting than in total darkness. So I think the government really needs to find a balance between this. I think we could give 20 seconds for the answer. Well, thank you for your question. Well, we hope that those who live in these intermingled districts would enjoy better quality sleep. Can see that many businesses actually have improved because they would switch off all the lights at around midnight. We are going to try to cater to all the demands of the different sectors. Thank you. Well, we still have members who would like to ask the first round in the first round, but I'm really sorry. We need to move on to the second round of questions because we have another agenda item. So 2 minutes each. Mr. Wong, thank you. I think the government needs to set legislature or policy regarding light pollution. There are two types that you really need to look into. One is for commercial use, whether it be, the window displays or advertising signs. You might need to set a ceiling that the light intensity should not exceed a certain figure, and then after a certain hour, then all the lights would need to be turned off. I think that if you come up with very specific requirements, then it would be easier to comply with. Secondly, I think the street lamps should also be looked into. If you go over to Dongchong near Yatong Estate, you would see lighting at every 1.5 meters on the pedestrian walkway. I think that the intensity of the lighting on that bridge is actually the same as daylight. So I think that you really should follow up with this. I remember when I was in university, that was 30 or 40 years ago, our school conducted a survey on lighting. And the lighting actually was cut by half. Even for lighting on some of the pedestrian walkways, lighting was cut by half. Well, we're talking about 30 to 40 years ago. But in Hong Kong, people like it bright in Hong Kong. But I think that we really need to try to change people's concept. Yes, you only need to adhere to a basic requirement for security. It doesn't need to be as bright as daylight for security. Well, the university you attended was not in Hong Kong, and of course yours is very environmentally friendly, so it's different from Hong Kong. Thank you. I sincerely hope that this administration would legislate light pollution. Through legislature, we'll be able to find a balance, and it would really close the page to lighting being unregulated in Hong Kong. I hope that I would see some result in next year's policy address. As no legislature has been made, how do you deal with complaints received? And residents usually complain at night, and that is out of office hours. So how do you handle these complaints? And is there anyone to take the complaints at night? Thank you.
Vivian?
Yes, Madam Chair.
With regard to how the EPD deals with complaints, well, basically the complaints will be filed with the district officers of the EPD, and as of today we have some 200 complaints, and most of them would be about nuisance caused at night. And in terms of the timing, is not a problem at all, but then in most cases we'll contact the complainant, and then we'll try to liaise with the owner of the lighting to see if the owner would be willing to reduce the lighting in order to reduce the nuisance that might be caused to the residents nearby. Yes, Mr. Kwok, well, thank you for giving us a response on the content of the complaints. But then for the numbers at NXB, as the chair said, these are lucky numbers, and they are not meaningful at all because we have no idea as to why the figures have gone up or come down. I hope that next time you'll not be doing that again. Or else, well, whether or not the guidelines have been effective or not, we would not be able to tell. And also for the guidelines that you've issued, is a process of collecting views on the legislation that might be introduced, but that is mainly a process, not the conclusion. Yes, Professor. Just on the first point, Up till now, in terms of the exemption for timing for important or major festive dates, yes, there will be exemptions, and also for necessary lighting and also lighting for security reasons, well, they will be granted exemptions. But then what's important is that we will have to conduct extensive consultation, so that in the course of the consultation, we'll see if there are further points that need to be considered. But then everybody will say that their lighting is for security reasons. So how are you going to avoid abuse by the owners of such lighting? Yes, I fully understand that, well, under the category of security, well, that light may have nothing to do with security, but then if he claims that it's for security, then can you do anything about it? But then, so in any event, you cannot avoid the issue of lighting power density, that is the issue of LPD. Yes, I've taken on board members' views, and I'll bring them back to the task force, and we'll review the situation again. Thank you. All right, thank you, Professor, and thank you, government officials. I hope that after the summer break, we'll come back to see a start of the legislative process on light pollution. Next, monitoring the outsourcing of the collection of recyclable materials and promotion of the recycling trade. With us today are Mr. Wong Kam Sing, the Secretary for the Environment, Ms. Michelle Au, Political Assistant, and Dr. Alan Chan, Assistant Director for the EPD, and Mr. Sin Kwok Hao, Assistant Director for the FEHD.
哇，咁快！咁就邊位官員同我哋
Would like to walk us through the paper number CB bracket 1, 1332 bracket 05. Chairman, I'll say a few words on how we support the recycling trade, and then I'll defer to the other colleagues. Well, in May 2013, we published the document, Hong Kong Blueprint for Sustainable Use of Resources 2013 to 2022. We map out a comprehensive strategy, targets, policies, and action plans for waste management that places emphasis on waste reduction and recovery. And the administration will be coming up with a series of measures and initiatives in response to the community's call for creating a more business environment for the recycling industry. We do have the determination to do this. Number one, well, on the source separation scheme, that will be expanded and deepened. And number two, we'll identify more suitable sites that will be leased on short-term tenancy basis, so that the recycling industry can bid for those sites in support of the recycling industry. And thirdly, we'll develop the Eco Park and its Phase 1, and we are moving on to Phase 2, and we have already completed the tenancy work. And also, we're going to call upon all government departments to implement a policy of e-procurement. We're actually trying to deepen that, and also we'll also be deepening the producer responsibility scheme, including WEEE. We are already at legislation stage, and also for the plastic bag levy, and also waste glass bottles and so on, and also through the ITF, and also the ECF, and also through the funds for the SMEs. We're trying to encourage the adoption of new technology for the recycling industry, and also the use of recyclable materials. We're trying to create a business conducive environment for that. And also in the 2013 policy address, we have also introduced a series of measures conducive to the recycling industry. And for example, in the PCWA, appropriate berths will be set aside for the recycling industry to bid for those berths. That's in response to the demands from the sector for a number of years. We have actually opened up this new opportunity for doing this. And also at these PCWA, well, the tenancy agreement or the lease will be expiring
very shortly, and therefore we will be doing more work in this area. I'll defer to the department then. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. In order to reduce waste, we have actually increased our source collection. So we're actually focusing on different types of materials, including rechargeable batteries and so on and so forth. And in public places, schools and government clinics and government departments and venues operated by government departments, including those run by the LCSD and also the AFCD, we have introduced the 3-color waste separation bins. And under the contract, the contractor will at least have to collect the waste once every week, or once the bins are more than 70% full, they will have to provide collection service. And also for the collected materials, they will also have to be delivered to the recyclers on the list given by the EPD. And the FEHD has put in place a comprehensive contract management mechanism, and under the contract, it sets out very clearly that the contractor will have to fulfill certain duties and performance requirements, and the supervisory staff of the department will also be conducting regular inspections as well as surprise checks in order to ensure that the contractor would be adhering to the terms of the contract. And if there are breaches found, then we'll take punitive actions, including verbal warnings, written warnings, or notices of default, DNs, to the contractor. And depending on the number of DNs issued, the monthly amount payable to the contractor will also be deducted accordingly. Recently, we have also noticed the increased occurrence of irregularities committed by the contractor. We are very concerned about that, and we have actually stepped up our regular inspections. And through our plainclothes colleagues, we have actually conducted more spot checks. And in August last year, after the commencement of the contract up till April this year, the FEHD has actually dealt with certain irregularities, and 2 warning letters have been issued, and 6 blatant DNs have been issued against improper disposal of recyclables. And also for the minor irregularities, 11 warning letters and 32 DNs have also been issued. The department will continue to monitor the contractor's performance closely, and with regard to the breaches, we will also be strictly enforcing the terms of the contract. We also noticed that this is a relatively major contract, and in the upcoming renewal of the contract, we will consider segregating that into some smaller contracts so that competition can be introduced, and that will also enable the department to more effectively monitor the performance of the contractors concerned. Thank you. Dr. Chen, anything you'd like to add? No? All right. Can I have an indication? All right, 5 have so far indicated that they'd like to ask questions. All right, more time will be given to the first round. All right, 7, Sin Chung Kai, Wu Chi Wei, Kwok Wai Keung, Albert Chen, Lo Wai Kwok, Yik Chi Ming, Kenneth Chen. 4 minutes each. All right. Because we also have to hand over the room to another meeting by 4:45. All right, 4 minutes first. Sin Chung Kai, para 24 of the paper. For materials with lower recycling value, well, according to some of our contacts, in fact, plastic materials, well, in fact, we do not have many factories here in Hong Kong, but then there are other places that would require the use of plastics. And if these plastics are recyclable, then that would be very valuable. So, which NGOs have been engaged in the Eco Park, and can you do anything to tie in with this effort of recovery and recycling? All right, for glass bottles, you're trying to introduce legislation to encourage the recovery and recycling of glass bottles. And similarly, what about plastic bottles? So if they can be recovered and recycled, and if you can work with places that have such a demand,
Well, for plastics, it's bio-undegradable. If they go to the landfills, then that would be forever. And if they can be reused and recycled, then that would also reduce the burden on the landfills. So is it possible to create such a market if you step up your efforts? For example, if you're going to introduce legislation for the recovery and recycling of glass bottles, $1 levy will be imposed. So what about plastics? Can something similar be done? Yes. Well, thank you, Mr. Sin, on plastic recycling. All right. Well, for Eco Park and other non-profit making bodies, for example, Yanoi Tong has been working on that. In fact, as far as plastics are concerned, in fact, we are facing another difficulty because on the mainland, since early this year, well, they've actually introduced a program, and the mainland enforcement authorities have tightened up the requirement on plastics. But then it's not about the standard per se. Actually, they're tightening up the enforcement so that for plastics that are being imported onto the mainland, they're actually applying a more stringent standards. That's why we've actually talked to the trade. And for the plastics that have been recovered, it will have to be clean. It cannot be mixed with other refuse. And they will also have to be grained. And in Southeast Asian countries, well, some of these countries still accept such plastics, and therefore we'll be talking to the recycling operators to see where they can go. For example, in housing estates and also schools and also in some business and industrial undertakings, well, in recovering plastics, we will have to tell the public very clearly what plastics can be recycled and what cannot be recycled, because if they are too dirty, then they cannot be recycled. I'm not talking about how you can recover them. I'm talking about exporting them. How do you help them? Because or if you're not able to export them, then you will have to dump them in the landfills. So it's not about importing them. It's about how you can turn them into something useful. So my question is, has the administration considered doing something similar to that for glass bottles, so that you might introduce legislation on the recovery and recycling of plastics? Well, some operators have told us that well, they will have to process the plastics, and there might be some high-end technology so that you can melt the plastics and turn it into fuel. So we are actually assisting them in doing this.
As to whether we could set up a mandatory program for the plastics like glass, I think that the Secretary can address this question. Thank you. Well, basically, our blueprint has already demonstrated a comprehensive strategy, targets, and policies. We're going to take this step by step. For plastic containers for drinks, this has also been included in our blueprint. And after the prioritized areas, we're going to follow up with these other issues. I'm sorry, Mr. Wu Chi-wei, time is up. Thank you. Well, I think we're looking at the same problem. This paper only talks about recycling. The recycling doesn't talk about the pollution brought out through the recycling process. The recycling material, if it is already polluted, then even if you recycle it, it's of no use anymore. You'll need to put it back in the landfill. You could see that many of the operators, they would just collect it, but then they will still need to dump it in the landfill because it has already been polluted. Now, this paper only talks about doing it on a voluntary basis, asking NGOs to help with it. Well, I think that after so many years, we know that this is not feasible. I don't understand whether the government is really determined to include recycling into your initiatives. The recycling materials, there must be an economic cost. As you said that with an economic cost, you would be able to improve the situation. But are you going to set an investment program or try to invest into recycling, or is it just like what the paper mentioned, to just encourage people to recycle more? So what is the economic value of the recyclable materials? We don't know about the value of these materials, but if you look at it as part of waste collection, then I think that you would understand that, this is valuable, much more valuable than just plain waste. So the government needs to invest more into the frontline work of the collection of recyclable materials. Perhaps you would need to, you could really reuse the recyclable materials to try to process them and to make them into something else. You can't just rely on exporting. What if the export country does not want to take our materials anymore? So how do you deal with those plastics that are not being accepted by those countries? How do you deal with them other than dumping them in the landfill? Thank you. Yes, our colleagues are also very concerned with this matter. We know that the material has not been taken into the landfill, so be rest assured. How can we link up the recyclable materials to our economy? I think you are more concerned with that. As Mr. Sin said, you should look into the investment of the production of reproducer responsibility, and then perhaps to charge on a pro rata basis on the waste. So everything must be linked with its economic value. So we do have an overall policy as to how much we recycle in the city and how much we export out. For example, on wood, on kitchen waste, we do have a number for these different kind of waste. Well, you didn't answer my question, Mr. Ho. Well, I think everyone has the same way of thinking. Well, there has been a blueprint previously. This is the second blueprint, but I'm sure that you all know that it is mainly talk on the first blueprint. We really hope that the second blueprint would bring results. The paper emphasizes on different kinds of recycling. Let's not talk about the recycling, the recyclers' performances first. I think you've heard enough from the media. We need to understand the views from the recyclers. Yes, having a recycling plant is good, but is it done well? Well, if you give land to these operators for doing recycling, then what other supplementary facilities should you give them? Well, we built our own exhibition center, but we gave it to someone else for management. You talk about, being self-financed, but, we're talking about waste. Everybody has the responsibility to do something about it. You can't just look at the profit. I think you would also need to invest a lot into these initiatives, so the government shouldn't only do it because of profit. Well, see, we look into wood and WEE and other plastics. Well, we don't accept the government saying that recyclable materials that do not have a high economic value should not be considered. I don't think we should accept this. Even if those materials are very low economic value, you still need to consider recycling these materials. I hope that the administration would dig deeper and further and try to really reduce the burden on our landfills. Thank you. I agree with Mr. Kwok's view. We do have a blueprint, but the biggest challenge is how to enforce and implement it. Well, do we need to build the plans for the operators? Well, for different waste, there would be different demands. It's different to recycle kitchen waste than to recycle wood wastage. So there is a technical difficulty here. Mr. Pro. Thank you. Well, we would provide other assistance. We know that it's very difficult for them to submit plans. We understand that there's a difficulty, so we do have a working group to help them to provide with these plans. Let's say they are going to recycle kitchen cooking oil waste, then we will try to work with the industries and then try to encourage them to use the materials to produce something else with it. But would anybody buy it? Then, through our different green purchase program, then we would find buyers for these products. Well, we are going to just continue discussing this topic forever, because I've talked to many secretaries in these few terms. Many overseas cities already mandatorily enforce the recycling of materials. Look at this paper. The topic is monitoring the outsourcing of the collection of recycling materials. This work should not be outsourced. It should be done by the government, but the government is giving up this responsibility, outsourcing it. Well, you drink Chinese white wine, and you would rather spend on shark fin than on the work. You don't want to do this work, so you outsource it. But effect is not good enough. Our waste is actually twice that of Japan's and Taiwan's and South Korea's. Our number is actually double than that of these countries. We do not do well in this matter because all the secretaries for the environment have been shirking their responsibilities. I think the first thing you need to enforce is not to enforce is not to allow the usage of plastic bags. Well, yes, you recycle in those 3-color waste separation bins, but then when you collect the waste, you would use one big plastic bag to wrap up all the waste from the bins. The government is just refusing to listen to us. Even when the government is sending people to weed the grass from the streets, you still use a huge plastic bag to collect the waste. So I think the first thing you need to do is to prohibit the usage of waste. You're actually creating a lot of waste. So the government, what it does best is to just find waste to put in the waste you create yourself. You're not doing anything. You would see that for the the FEHD, you would have like 18 tiers of departments. Then, the frontline staff, he only gets like $30 per hour, and he's the one collecting waste. But the one creating the waste is actually the one sitting in the office and getting a huge pay. So I really think that you really need to look into your own problem. And I think that for recyclable materials, you should not just only look at plastics. You should also look into kitchen waste. Because if you can do this well, then you could reduce the burden on our landfills in Hong Kong. The land supply. If you are really to provide land supply, then we really need to estimate the cost. You also need to look into the figures to analyze it. How many households are you talking about? Are you collecting 3-color waste separation bins? Are you going to add in kitchen waste and glass bottles? What is the surface area we're talking about? You need to estimate all the figures. If you don't do this cautiously, you're just creating waste to make more waste. Mr. Low, there are 3 things I'd like to talk about. This is actually a very important topic. People actually query if we really recycle half of our recyclable materials. People would see the 3-color waste separation bins on the street, but sometimes the waste of these 3 bins are actually put together, and its ultimate place would actually be the landfill instead of recycling plants. So I want to know if you're really just recycling wood, plastics, and paper. And what is the total volume we're talking about? And how much of it could be recycled internally? Of course, the percentage would be small, but we still do that. And secondly, and how much of it is exported? And thirdly, how much of it is not exported nor recycled and sent to the landfill? I want to know some of the figures. Well, if you really recycle half of the recycled materials, I want to know how you are doing it, so that we could really target the problems and try to resolve the issues, and so we can work together and to improve the situation. Let's take plastics as an example. Plastics take up a lot of space, but we need to send it to the landfill, and sometimes it's very difficult for us to really recycle because the cost is high. So if you could give us some figures and give us some analysis, then it would really help us with concrete work. But I think in the past, I've asked for similar figures. Or how can we really reduce 40% of our waste in 10 years? We really need to try to see ways of improving it. And each year we take in about 30,000 tons, 3 million tons of recycled waste. Of course, we're not talking about the entire recycling sector, but it's very difficult for us to deal with these materials internally, and that is the reason why I want you to give me the figures.
Another important issue is with regard to WEEE, the Producer Responsibility Scheme. Well, according to plans, there will be a plan to segregate the spare parts so that the recyclable parts can be recycled. So I'd like to know the concrete timetable for that, because in paragraph 31 of the paper, you said that you're actually preparing the legislative proposals on that, but then at this time we haven't got a timetable. So when will we be able to see that being done?
And also according to the sector, with regard to the logistics park for recycling, when will that take place? All right, I'll defer to Dr. Chen. All right, we only have about 20 seconds left, so you may have to provide a supplementary paper later. All right, for the plant, well, we'll start the tendering in around July, August this year. Yes, Mr. Frankie Yik. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not a member of the panel, but then thank you very much for allowing me to speak. Well, in the paper, you've also stated that for the current operator, he's not doing well. And I wonder if you've heard the phone-in program this morning. There's a radio phone-in program, and a caller said that, all right, they've actually sorted the materials, but then subsequently they were mixed again. So it's about the understanding on the part of the public and also the staff concerned. So there has not been sufficient training for that, so you will have to do something about it. And also, as Dr. Lo Wai Kwok also mentioned in para 18 of the paper, you talk about some 50,000 tons being recycled from the tenants of the Eco Park. In fact, only 1.67% has been recollected and recycled. And also in Para 16, well, many people are adopting a not-in-my-backyard attitude towards recycling STT sites. But then the thing is, the administration is still adopting this STT approach. So this is in itself a contradictory approach. All right, according to the sector, all right, they've got a site, but then after they form the site, there is no power supply and so on, and after 3 years, they'll have to move and relocate. So how would that work? So as Mr. Albert Chen just said, the administration should take up its responsibility. It should have been funded by the administration instead of asking the trade to fund the operations. So in terms of the land, there should be more long-term planning. You will have to provide greater support to them. For example, you should offer them rent-free, and that would also save the government money. Is that right? So I wonder if the Bureau Director agrees with that statement. Yes, Dr. Chen. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Yik. With regard to the mixing of the sorted materials in the on board of the MTR train, I'll talk about that later. In fact, you said that for the STT approach, yes, it's a 3-year contract, and very often the tenants would be rather reluctant to come up with more long-term capital investments into those operations. Well, we also have to work with the relevant departments. So instead of offering STT sites, is it possible to come up with longer-term sites? For example, underneath the flyover and what, so that the recycling sector will know that it's not just for 3 or 5 years. So we'll take it back and discuss it with the relevant departments. Thank you. All right, instead of charging them a rent, can the administration offering them some funding because they are actually helping you to do the job? Well, if we have the producer responsibility scheme, for example, for plastic, or for glass bottles, and also for on WEEE, that would incur government funding or expenses. So we will have to look at the materials concerned. For example, if they have their own value, for example, for scrap metal and also for waste paper, it's not about funding one thing and not the other. It's something that we will have to consider very carefully. We will look into that. Sorry. Yes, Mr. Sin? Yes, Madam Chair. As I said at the opening statement, well, the FEHD is responsible for putting the 3-color bins at the public places, for example, hospitals, clinics, and also public venues. Well, for housing estates, well, the FEHD has not provided any assistance at all. Do you accept the answer, Mr. Yik? Talking about how you can enhance awareness and how you can train up the staff instead of just telling us that you wash your hand free from that. All right, we will have to talk to the airport authority, and even the MTRCL will take that up with them and will be reminding them as to what they should do. Yes, Dr. Chen. All right, the paper is about monitoring of the outsourcing of the collection of recyclable materials and promotion of the recycling sector. Well, we are very interested in that, but then according to the paper, some of the details have been mentioned here, but I have a few questions. All right, you have these 3 color bins, and many departments are involved in this effort. I'd like to know from the Bureau's perspective, in terms of coordination, have there been difficulties? Because, well, there is a need for a division of labor, but then has that been done very smoothly? And can the Environment Bureau call the shots? Or do you have to work with other bureaus and departments? And in the process, has there been any coordination problems? And then in terms of the control and regulation, there might have been problems. That's why you have not been able to do a satisfactory job. And also, Para 9 is about the outsourcing by the FEHD. There was one single contractor, and last year, since August last year, you've had some problems. But then according to the paper, there have been many breaches, and all right, you've also issued warnings and so on, 13 to plus 38, almost 60, and over 50 breaches. So within just a year's time, you've also admitted that the situation is not satisfactory, and you actually are considering breaking that down into smaller contracts in the future. So have you conducted any analysis? How come there have been so many breaches and irregularities? So there have been over 50 such cases. And also for glass bottles, all right, there might be one contractor or more, and you will have to learn from the experience, or else you come back and then we'll criticize you for asking us to accept just one single contractor. So please respond to the 2 questions first. Thank you, Dr. Chen. For the second question, I'll defer to the FEHD. Well, I think we have all learned a lesson from this, and therefore next time when we introduce the scheme on glass bottles, we'll try to learn from this lesson. As regards the recycling bins, all right, it involves different departments, but then we're actually conducting an overall review, for example, whether it's in country parks or roadside and so on. So we have to reform the color bins. So please rest assured. So we'll be working together with all the departments and bureaus concerned. But then I'm concerned that you might have a policy up there, but then when it comes to the actual implementation and enforcement, departments might not take heed of your instructions, all right? So can that be placed under one authority instead of just distributing the work in different departments? So you might just be back to square one if it's done separately by different departments and bureaus. Mr. Sin, on the performance of the existing contractor, yes, we have also noticed that there is a lot of room for improvement. That's why we have stepped up regular inspections and spot checks, and we have also deployed plainclothes inspectors to follow up on that. That's why in areas where we might not have detected in the past to have irregularities, we have issued warnings, including some minor breaches. For example, they might have been late in arriving at a particular collection point, or if their staff have not put on the uniform, then we would be issuing warning letters or DNs. And as a result, there might have been an increased number of such warnings and so on. And since last month, we have been following up on that, and we can see that the situation has improved somewhat, and they have not really disposed of the recycled materials haphazardly, but then on better coordination with all the relevant departments. In fact, on a regular basis, we would invite the EPD and other departments to sit down and sort things out. And if we have collected any particular views or comments, if there is suggestion that collection points have not been adequate at a particular location, or if these bins are causing obstruction to the passers-by and so on, then through the feedback that we have collected, we'll see how the alignment and also the location of the color bins can be improved. So we do sit down on a regular basis to sort things out. Yes, Ms. Claudia Mo. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, regrettably, the contractor only came in since August last year, and then he has been found to have committed so many breaches. So obviously, with one single contractor, he's monopolizing the situation, and once he commits
some mistakes, then all right, day in day out, you're engaging plainclothes officers to find out if he's doing well. That's why we have this problem. Then at least in the future you should have 3 contractors instead of just one single contractor for the entire territory. All right, he'll call the shots and he'll do everything. All right, this is a 2-year contract, and he would of course do a lousy job if there is no competition. But then for the 3 color bins, well, in Yau Chi Mong district, I've received numerous complaints saying that they saw it happening on the ground. All right, for waste paper, plastics, and also aluminium cans. Actually, they're mixing everything together. And then when they asked the contractor where they are taking these materials to, they said that to the landfills. All right, what are you doing? Because we have worked very hard to sort things and then put them in different color bins. So there is still 1 more year to go. So what are you going to do with this contractor? All right, he should have sorted the materials and the garbage, but then to what extent is he doing his job? All right, I cannot put the blame on the new term of government, because after all, it's not you who introduced this in the first place. But then there are many Hong Kong people who might not have noticed that there are certain details involved. And if you dispose of newspaper, you should not put in this chewing gum in it, or else you'll be spoiling everything. And then for the glass bottles, all right, for aluminium cans, all right, after you've consumed a bottle of soft drink, you should not put in cigarette ends and also tissue paper in it too, because many people might not be aware of them. They might think that you're going to sort things anyway. Well, we have paid visits to South Korea, and for food waste, well, because there are toothpicks, and then they will also try to change the materials into something that would be disposable. But then our awareness is not high enough. I can see that there are many people who might be holding this Coca-Cola can or bottle, and then after they have consumed some food, they would just put the cigarette end into the aluminium cans, and then they would still place the or put the aluminium can into the color bins. You will have to increase the awareness before you can actually do a good job in source separation. And also for these 3 color bins, all right, that should have been done by the EPD or another department. All right, many tourists are complaining that for the English subtitle, they are querying the use of the word cum, C-U-M, because it's really eye-glaring, because the color bins are everywhere, and they are querying how the word is used.
Thank you. Well, I agree with what you said. We need to try to raise awareness in the public. Many recycling workers have reflected to us that there is room for improvement for the hygiene of the recycling bins, and many people are not of huge respect of the bins. We want to launch a clean and hygienic recycling bin campaign, because for a can there might be 3 different kinds of plastics with it. So we want to teach the public not only to just separate it by paper, metal, and plastic materials. They also need to really to separate it in detail. Well, okay, I have 4 minutes as well. In para 23. You said the recyclable of low values, including waste plastics, glass, mud bottles, WEE, and wood, would require some assistance to make their collection and recycling viable. So, what kind of assistance would you provide? Our party said that 2 billion should be taken out of our treasury to provide assistance to make their collection and recycling viable, and that would provide 10,000 frontline job opportunities, and some money would be left for design. Now, this is our suggestion. You might not agree to it, but you said that the assistance should be required. So what kind of assistance are you suggesting? Thank you for your question. I think we all have the same vision to try to recycle more. The paper gave a few proposals, such as the program of glass recycling, and also on community participation, and try to charge for waste. Well, in some other countries, you would see that if you charge for the waste, the money collected would be put in funding to use back into recycling. If the public believes that this would really encourage more recycling initiatives, then we would also cautiously consider these proposals. But we need to look into whether a funding concept should also be included. I think you really need to consider, because we're going to vote on Wednesday and also to vote on July 5th. I think that the Labour Party is also coming up with a proposal. They're suggesting a fund. They're talking about a one lump sum, and as for our party, we're considering a 2 billion funding each year. Well, according to your blueprint, 44% of it is kitchen waste. In the kitchen waste recycling center, we're talking about dealing with about 5 million tons. But I think that you have much more kitchen waste than that. Would you try to build a multi-story building for recycling kitchen waste, and are you going to set up more facilities? Can you try to expedite the process of dealing with kitchen waste? Well, yes, kitchen waste is something that Hong Kong needs to deal with. We're looking at different premises, but this takes time. I'm sure you all understand that, especially in high-density cities, there is a certain difficulty. The New York City mayor also said earlier that they want to step up work in this effort to try to reach a higher percentage in recycling. Well, right now we have 2 kitchen waste recycling centers, and we also have part of our kitchen waste being produced into fish feed. Actually, we are doing much better than New York City. Of course, we will need to set a higher target. Taiwan can now recycle about half of the kitchen waste, and of course, we'll need to learn from it and make a better effort. Well, yes, I hope that before the Public Works panel hold its meeting, I hope the PWSC hold its meeting, I hope that you will submit it to us. Well, you have to tell us the complexities of doing it. I mean, nobody is in objection of providing a kitchen waste recycling center, so we really do want you to try to recycle a higher volume of food waste. Well, we have till 4:45, so you would each have 4 minutes in the second round of questions. Mr. Wu, thank you. Well, yes, we could go back to the paper. Plastics is a headache for all of us. But yes, we do have a company that deals with plastics. It actually provides play mats for children facilities for the government. It actually imports plastic waste and it produces it to become high value added products. I'm not sure if the government knows about it, but if you do we really need to take some initiatives or try to think of ways to try to recycle our own plastics and not just dump it all in the landfill? Can we try to do something ourselves in Hong Kong? I think this is a huge irony. What is the industry really like in Hong Kong? Has the government really done an in-depth analysis on the recycling process? For recyclers of low values, we know that it's difficult to make recycling viable. You also need to set up a production line for the glass, to reduce glass about, we're talking about 100 tons here. The government must really bear some responsibility and be willing to invest. To try to look into the overall cost. We can't just divide this up by different departments and then ask them to estimate their own cost. If you could use 2 billion a year to set up a funding. No, I'm sorry. I would clarify. Funding. We're talking about the workers' union. I'm talking about our party. A recurrent expenditure of 2 billion. Of course, if you talk about 5 billion, we welcome that figure. I think that I want to hear about the government policy. I don't have any objection to your major direction. Yes, it seems that you have a halo on top of your head, but I really want to hear how you are going to take concrete measures. Thank you. You mentioned a list to see how much of the recyclable waste is from Hong Kong, how much of it is imported. Yes, we could go back and look at the figures. And regarding the question of trying to recycle plastics to make it into high value added children products, I am going to look into how local industries can help us to reuse our materials locally. How can we invest more into this industry to really try to recycle within the city? We understand your concern, but this is quite complicated and we will need more time to look into this issue. Mr. Kwok, thank you. Yes, we have suggested setting up an environment funding to assist green industries. Of course, this is only a start. We want the government to continue its investment each year I think that all the charges for plastic bags should also be included in the funding. If we could save money on reducing the volume on landfill, then that should also be put under the funding as well. I think that assistance should be given to recycling operators. Each year we're only talking about 1 billion to 2 billion, and I think that this should be sustainable. I want to go back to the 3-color bins. Although the government said that it is very effective, in our eyes, we don't think so. We remember the bins in North Point. Actually, it's very full and it's not very it's not very well separated. And even in Tin Hao, it's the same case. When we first launched the three colorway separation bins campaign, it seemed to be a major promotion, but nowadays, not too many people talk about it. Maybe you would think that the schools are teaching the children and everybody already know about it. But as Hong Kong is a tourist city, do tourists know about our recycling bins? Tourists coming from all over the countries, well, if they don't separate their waste, it's still not going to work. You can't criticize the frontline worker for just dumping everything into one big plastic bag because it's not separated at all. Well, I know there's a penalty for throwing away garbage on the street. So I want to know whether there is a penalty for not recycling properly. The green groups have counted the number of garbage bins and recycling bins. On Nathan Road, the ratio is 1:7. For every 3 colorway separation bins, there would be 7 regular rubbish bins. Well, if the government said that it's so effective, would you consider improving the ratio? Well, we spent a lot of time talking about recycling today. Well, I think that everything is more effective if you start from prevention. Well, if we could try to reduce the usage of plastics, then it would be even better. In our recent campaigns, we are trying to encourage people not to use disposable items. We also want to raise the awareness in trying to separate the waste. And of course, we hope to do more in terms of advertising to the tourists. For the ratio of recycling bins, I don't think that the number is low in Hong Kong. But yes, if you compare it to regular rubbish bins, yes, the ratio is low. We do have enough recycling bins. We just need to teach the public how to fully utilize these resources. Well, should we ask our canteen not to give us disposable utensils in the future? Well, since you're all eating here anyways, you all have your own chopsticks and your own utensils, so why do we need to use disposable ones? Well, thank you all for attending. Well, although we do not have too many people here right now, regarding our suggestion to ask the canteen not to provide us with disposable utensils, well, I'm sure you have no objection. Well, I think we need to learn from Korea. Well, I think that for disposable food containers, maybe we should also use all paper as well. Maybe you need to pay a deposit. Well, no, I think that it should be like the factories on the mainland. You should all bring your own containers, and that would be much better. Thank you all for attending. I hope that you would all take measures to protect the environment, and please lobby to the other members and hope that you would provide us with more information on Wednesday so that we can put it to vote. Well, thank you.
因為你起幾多個泳池都搞唔掂個堆填區爆棚㗎，即係。